Kevin O'Sullivan was determined that day to tell Meghan Markle the truth with British journalistic severity. The confrontation that followed forced the former royal to flee the studio in tears. The GB News studio hummed with its characteristic blend of nervous energy and anticipation as crew members made final adjustments to cameras and lighting equipment. The sleek, modern set with its bold red and blue color scheme had become synonymous with uncompromising journalism and fearless debate. Today, however, the atmosphere carried an unusual tension that even the most seasoned production staff could sense. Kevin O'Sullivan sat at the anchor desk, methodically reviewing his research notes with the focused intensity that had made him one of British media's most formidable personalities. As a veteran entertainment journalist turned television presenter, he had built his reputation on asking the uncomfortable questions that other interviewers avoided and refusing to accept polished PR responses from celebrities who thought their status protected them from scrutiny. His preparation for today's interview had been more thorough than usual. Folders of documentation lay scattered across his desk, court records, timeline discrepancies, contradictory statements from various interviews, and a detailed analysis of claims made versus verifiable facts. This wasn't going to be another softball celebrity interview. This was going to be a reckoning. Dan Wootton occupied his usual position as co-host, his own reputation for controversial takes and fearless commentary complementing Kevin's more analytical approach. The two men had developed a professional rhythm that allowed them to tag-team difficult guests, with one playing the role of aggressive prosecutor while the other provided supporting evidence and follow-up questions. At precisely 2:15 p.m., a black Mercedes with heavily tinted windows pulled up to the GB News studios in Paddington. Meghan Markle emerged wearing an elegant burgundy blazer over a cream silk blouse, her appearance carefully calculated to project both authority and approachability. Her smile was confident as she waved to the small crowd of photographers who had gathered, but those who looked closely might have noticed a slight tightness around her eyes that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with her decision to appear on a network known for its confrontational style. Her security detail was notably extensive for a daytime television appearance, consisting of 3 plainclothes officers who seemed more concerned with image management than actual physical protection. The fact that she needed such security for what was ostensibly a friendly promotional interview spoke volumes about her current relationship with the British public and media. The Green Room provided a temporary sanctuary from the controlled chaos of live television production. Meghan sat in a leather armchair, sipping herbal tea while her remaining publicist hovered nearby with a tablet full of talking points and carefully rehearsed responses. They had spent hours preparing for this appearance, knowing that GB News was unlike the sympathetic American outlets she had grown accustomed to. 10 minutes to air, a production assistant announced, and Meghan felt that familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that accompanied live television. She had specifically chosen to appear on GB News because she believed she could handle their style of questioning and perhaps even win over some skeptical British viewers. This confidence would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Her phone buzzed with an encouraging text from Harry, reminding her to stay focused on their narrative of truth-telling and healing. The message brought a slight smile to her face, reinforcing her belief that this interview would follow the same pattern as her recent American appearances, perhaps with tougher questions, but ultimately manageable if she stuck to her prepared talking points. The walk from the Green Room to the studio felt different from her previous television experiences. The corridors of GB News carried an atmosphere of serious journalism rather than celebrity-friendly entertainment, and the staff members she encountered seemed more focused on news gathering than on making guests feel comfortable. This should have been a warning sign, but Meghan's confidence in her own media skills blinded her to the reality of what she was walking into. Kevin O'Sullivan stood to greet her as she entered the studio, his handshake firm and professional but notably lacking the warmth she had grown accustomed to from American television hosts. "Meghan, thank you for joining us today. This should be an interesting conversation." "Thank you for having me, Kevin," she replied, her voice carrying that carefully modulated tone she had perfected, confident but not arrogant, warm but not overly familiar. "I'm looking forward to it." Dan Wootton offered his own greeting, and the three of them engaged in brief pre-interview small talk that was noticeably more perfunctory than the extended charm offensive she usually experienced. The conversation touched on the weather and the studio's impressive setup, but there was an underlying professionalism that suggested this would be a serious journalistic encounter rather than a promotional love fest. 2 minutes to live, the floor director announced, and everyone took their positions. Meghan settled into the guest chair with practiced confidence, crossing her legs and placing her hands in her lap in that distinctly royal posture she had never quite abandoned. Her latest children's book sat prominently on the desk between them, though something about the way Kevin glanced at it suggested it might not remain the focus of the conversation for long. The red recording lights blinked on, and suddenly they were broadcasting live to hundreds of thousands of viewers across the UK. "Good afternoon, and welcome to GB News," Kevin began with his characteristic authority and directness. "I'm Kevin O'Sullivan, and we're joined today by Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, who's here to discuss her latest children's book and her ongoing charitable work." "Meghan, welcome to GB News." "Thank you, Kevin. It's wonderful to be here," Meghan replied, her smile bright and camera-ready. "I'm excited to share this important message about empowering children to find their voices." Dan leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine interest. "The book does seem to carry a very personal message about speaking your truth. That must resonate strongly with your own experiences over the past few years." It was a reasonable opening question, and Meghan launched into a well-rehearsed response about the importance of authentic communication and helping children develop confidence in expressing themselves. Her answers were polished and emotionally engaging, hitting all the right notes about empowerment and positive messaging. For the first 8 minutes, everything proceeded within normal parameters. The questions focused on the book's themes and her charitable endeavors, allowing Meghan to present herself as a caring mother and advocate for children's welfare. She began to relax, feeling that perhaps GB News wasn't as confrontational as its reputation suggested. But then Kevin's demeanor shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible to viewers but immediately obvious to Meghan. His posture straightened slightly, and his tone took on a sharper edge that suggested the real interview was about to begin. "Meghan," he said, setting down his notes and looking directly at her, "I want to ask you about something that's been troubling many of our viewers, particularly those who followed your time as a working royal very closely." The slight change in his approach activated Meghan's internal warning systems, though she maintained her composed exterior. "Of course, Kevin. What's on your mind?" Kevin leaned forward slightly, his eyes taking on the focused intensity that had made him one of Britain's most feared interviewers. "You've spoken extensively about your commitment to truth-telling and authentic communication, but many people have noticed significant inconsistencies between what you said during your time in the royal family and what you're saying now. How do you explain those contradictions?" The question landed with surgical precision, and Meghan's carefully maintained composure flickered for just a moment before her media training kicked in. "I think people evolve in their understanding of their experiences, Kevin. Sometimes it takes time and distance to fully comprehend what you've been through. But we're not talking about evolution or understanding," Kevin pressed, his voice carrying the relentless quality that had made his reputation. "We're talking about fundamental contradictions. For example, in 2018, you gave multiple interviews expressing gratitude and excitement about your role. You spoke about feeling welcomed and supported. Now you're telling a completely different story. Which version should the British public believe?" Dan Wootton joined the attack with supporting evidence. "We have video footage, Meghan. We have your own words from just a few years ago. Are you suggesting that all of those statements were lies?" Meghan's hands, which had been resting casually in her lap, began to fidget with her wedding ring, a tell that experienced interviewers learned to recognize as a sign of increasing stress. "I think both things can be true simultaneously. I was grateful for many aspects of the experience while also facing significant challenges that I wasn't comfortable discussing publicly at the time." Kevin's expression remained professionally neutral, but his questions grew more pointed. "That's an interesting way to put it, but let's be specific. In your engagement interview, you said you were excited to hit the ground running and serve the Commonwealth. You spoke about how wonderful it was to have a platform to champion causes you cared about. Were you lying then, or are you lying now?" The directness of the question struck Meghan like a physical blow. Her composed facade began to crack as she struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't contradict her current narrative. "I don't appreciate the implication that I was lying about anything. Those were my genuine feelings at the time, but situations can become more complex as they develop." "Complex how?" Kevin demanded, his journalistic instincts fully engaged now. "You were given a global platform, unlimited resources, and the opportunity to champion any cause you wanted. What exactly became so unbearable that you felt the need to abandon your commitments and move to America?" Dan supported with additional pressure. "And let's not forget the financial aspects. You've claimed you were cut off financially, but court documents show you continued to receive substantial support from the Prince of Wales well into 2020. Why misrepresent those facts?" Meghan's breathing had become noticeably more shallow, and her voice carried a defensive edge that hadn't been there at the beginning of the interview. Those are private financial matters that you couldn't possibly understand the full context of. Private? Kevin's voice rose with incredulity. But you discussed them publicly in your interview with Oprah. You made them a central part of your victim narrative. How can they be private when you've shared them with 50 million viewers? The word victim hit Meghan like a slap across the face. Her composure cracked visibly as she leaned forward aggressively. I was never playing the victim. I was sharing my truth about experiences that were genuinely difficult and traumatic. Kevin leaned back slightly, studying her with the same intensity he had once used to analyze celebrity scandals for tabloid newspapers. Your truth again. That's a very convenient phrase, isn't it? Because it allows you to say anything you want without having to worry about whether it's actually accurate or fair to the other people involved. It is accurate. Meghan's voice rose just enough to be noticeable to viewers. Everything I've said has been my honest recollection of events as I experienced them. Dan seized the opening. But that's the problem, isn't it? Your honest recollection keeps changing. The timeline shifts. The details evolve. The level of alleged mistreatment increases with each telling. That's not consistent truth-telling. That's story development. Meghan's eyes began to fill with tears of rage and humiliation. You're twisting my words. You're taking things out of context to create a narrative that serves your agenda. Kevin's voice remained maddeningly calm in contrast to her escalating emotion. I'm not twisting anything, Meghan. I'm simply comparing your own statements from different time periods. If pointing out those inconsistencies constitutes twisting, perhaps the problem isn't with the questions but with the answers. The problem, Meghan shot back, her voice breaking slightly, is that people like you will never accept that someone can have complex feelings about complex situations. You want everything to be black and white because it makes for better television. Actually, Kevin replied with surgical precision, what makes for better television is when people tell the truth consistently rather than adapting their stories for maximum sympathy and profit. The word profit triggered something explosive in Meghan's emotional state. She shot to her feet so violently that her chair rocked backward, her face flushed with rage and humiliation. How dare you, she shouted, her voice echoing through the studio. How dare you sit there and question my integrity when you know nothing about what I've been through? Kevin remained seated, looking up at her with an expression of calm professionalism that somehow made her emotional breakdown appear even more dramatic. I know what you've told us you've been through. The question is whether we can believe it. Of course you can believe it. Meghan screamed, tears now streaming down her face. Why would I lie about something so painful? Why would I put myself through this if it wasn't true? Dan provided the devastating response. Because it's made you millions of pounds, Meghan. Because it's given you a platform you never would have had otherwise. Because playing the victim of the British royal family is incredibly profitable in America. Something inside Meghan completely snapped. Her carefully constructed public persona abandoned her entirely as she grabbed her purse from the floor beside her chair, her movements jerky and uncoordinated in her emotional distress. This interview is over, she declared, her voice breaking on every word. I came here in good faith, and you've ambushed me with lies and personal attacks. Kevin stood slowly, his imposing presence making the situation even more tense. The only person who's been lying here is you, Meghan, and I think most of our viewers can see that. You're monsters, she sobbed, her voice rising to a near shriek. All of you. You invite people on your shows just to humiliate them for entertainment. We invite people on our shows to ask them difficult questions, Kevin replied, his voice carrying the steady authority that had made him a trusted figure in British journalism. If you can't handle that, perhaps you shouldn't be making public claims about other people's behavior. As Meghan turned to flee, Kevin delivered what would become the most quoted line of the entire interview. Meghan, he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent studio. The next time you want to rewrite history, make sure you're not doing it in the country where the history actually happened. Because we remember, and we're not as easily fooled as you think we are. Meghan stopped dead in her tracks, her entire body trembling with barely contained fury. For a moment, it looked like she might turn around and physically confront him. Instead, she pressed both hands to her face, let out what sounded like a wail of anguish, and ran toward the exit. Her heels clicked frantically against the studio floor as she fled, the sound amplifying in the oppressive silence that had fallen over the entire space. The cameras followed her until she disappeared through the stage door, leaving behind a quiet so complete that even the technical crew seemed to have stopped their usual bustling. For several long moments, nobody moved. Kevin sat back down at the anchor desk, straightening his tie with the composure of someone who had just completed a difficult but necessary job. Dan remained frozen, clearly processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Finally, Kevin turned to face the camera with the professionalism that had defined his career. "Well," he said, his voice carrying none of the emotion that had characterized the previous few minutes, "I think that tells us everything we need to know about the reliability of certain people's claims." Dan found his voice, though it came out slightly hoarse. "That was certainly illuminating." "It was necessary," Kevin replied firmly. "Someone needed to ask these questions. If she can't handle basic scrutiny of her own contradictory statements, perhaps she shouldn't be making those statements in the first place." As the show cut to commercial, the production team scrambled to process what had just occurred. Phone lines were already lighting up with viewer reactions, social media was exploding with clips and commentary, and news outlets across Britain were beginning to cover the story. The remainder of the show proceeded with Kevin and Dan analyzing the interview and taking calls from viewers, but everyone knew that nothing could overshadow the dramatic confrontation they had just witnessed. The footage would be replayed endlessly, analyzed by media experts, and debated in living rooms across the country. Meanwhile, somewhere in the GB News building, Meghan Markle was probably locked in a bathroom, trying to repair her makeup and compose herself enough to face the inevitable photographers waiting outside. Her security team was likely coordinating an emergency exit strategy while her publicist fielded frantic calls from concerned associates and attempted to craft some kind of damage control narrative. But the damage was irreversible. In less than 25 minutes, one of Britain's most fearless journalists had systematically dismantled years of carefully managed public relations work. He had exposed the fundamental contradictions in her narrative, questioned her motives, and reduced her to tears on live television. Whether you agreed with his methods or not, one thing was undeniable: Kevin O'Sullivan had asked the questions that millions of British viewers had been thinking but that no one else had dared to voice so directly. His refusal to be intimidated by celebrity status or royal connections had created a moment of television that would be remembered and analyzed for years to come. The truth, as Kevin had suggested, was indeed not easily rewritten when confronted by people who actually remembered the original version. And sometimes, the most effective way to expose manufactured narratives was simply to ask their creators to explain the inconsistencies in their own words. In those 25 minutes, British television had witnessed the complete deconstruction of a modern celebrity's attempt to control public perception through emotional manipulation and selective memory. The architect of that deconstruction had been a fearless journalist who understood that accountability doesn't recognize titles, celebrity status, or claims of victimhood. The message was clear: in Britain, at least, you couldn't simply rewrite history to suit your current needs. And when someone tried to do exactly that, there would always be journalists like Kevin O'Sullivan ready to remind them, and everyone watching, of what actually happened.